Hi again, everybody, moms and dads, boys and girls. You were in the chatter zone. This is episode 165. Michael Matt is in the house. He was not in the house on episode 56, which was over 2 years ago.
Oh, wow. That's a long time.
Yeah, it is. Michael, good to have you in the house.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I love the Remnant underground, and just for you, we're in the underground bunker.
I feel very comfortable here.
He has a much nicer set on the underground than we have here.
Yes, yeah.
This is a real bunker.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. But we love Michael Matt and his show. We carried on the radio, and he's got a long time history with newspapers. So for our listeners who don't know who Michael Matt is, why don't you give us just a little background on you and your family? And
Sure. We are a Catholic newspaper publishing family. So my great-grandfather began a newspaper called Der Wanderer, which it's still in existence in St. Paul. It's called The Wanderer now. They anglicized it. My grandfather made it an English language paper during the 1930s. And my father was in World War II and was a correspondent at that time for Stars and Stripes and things like that. He was sort of keeping an eye on the situation with the war, and also stayed on as a correspondent for The Wanderer during those years. My grandfather ran the newspaper then, and then my father took over in about 1967. There was a great deal of upheaval between my father and his brother over the Second Vatican Council and over the Liturgical Revolution. So my father then started a newspaper called The Remnant, which is also up in St. Paul. And that's about 60 years ago that started. So we're 150 years in, and lots of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the focus has changed a little bit, because my grandfather, or my great-grandfather, when he founded the newspaper, was answering the call of Pope Leo XIII, who was calling upon German newspaper men to do something to sort of get in the way of the Freemasonic attack that was going on against especially German immigrants. So in those years, grandfather, great-grandfather were very much defending everything the popes were saying. The social teaching of Christ the King, that was being the great social teachings of those popes, Leo XIII, Pius IX, of course, Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII. And then the tragic thing, maybe for your listeners, it would be interesting, how the revolution in the church finally blew my family apart, and they found themselves suddenly hearing, coming from Rome, the things that they had been defending against, for generations. So I think that even in my own family history, then there's indication of the infiltration of the church. How all of a sudden the very errors that Leo XIII had been trying to recruit Catholic newspaper men to fight against found their way into the Vatican itself, into Rome itself, and all of a sudden there's this peculiar situation where for 160 years these men had been absolute faithful defenders of the papacy, found themselves in this very strange position of having to take issue with things that were coming from the papacy, from the popes, and that was heartbreaking, and just in many ways it really destroyed them, as far as their lives as Catholics were completely turned around. So I always bring that up just so that people can understand from a traditional Catholic point of view. Nobody wants to be in this position of having to ask hard questions of the Pope, and it's ridiculous, especially if you think of it from the point of view of non-Catholics. What's with you people? You don't get along? You have some kind of issue with your own leadership?
Right.
Well, that's a crazy position to be in. Nobody wants to be in this, and please God, the efforts that we're all making with our priests and bishops, good bishops all around the world, will one day, in God's time, bear fruit, and we can all go back to dropping traditional Catholic, the word traditional, and simply being Catholic, because that's all we ever wanted to be. It's all we want to be now.
Yeah. So you mentioned traditional Catholic. How would you define a traditional Catholic?
In my opinion, there's different ways of doing it, but I think the simplest way is traditional Catholic is just simply a Catholic who accepts everything the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches, and who worships according to the liturgy for 1,965 years. And liturgically, we could say 1,969 years, which is when the liturgical changes came in. So far from the perception, it's an unfortunate perception, that we are holier than you and that we're smarter than you. It's almost just the opposite. I've got friends who go to the Novus Ordo, and I think, these people are holier than I am. Despite the abuses that are going on liturgically, they're somehow staying on as Catholics, and I think that's a beautiful thing. So I don't condemn them. But for those of us who are just trying to raise our children and be sure that we're living the Catholic life, we're just trying to do it in a way that we know the only certitude we have is what the church infallibly taught for almost 2,000 years. We're seizing on that. We're holding on to that as our lifeline. So a traditional Catholic is just someone who lives the way the faith always had been lived. And then in terms of polemics, all we ever do is we make statements of the obvious. We state the statements of the obvious, which are reiterate the doctrinal teachings of the church. These are infallible teachings of the church. Very little of our opinion comes into it. So what I'm saying, I guess, is the ideal traditional Catholic is not an opinionated jerk. He's somebody who relies 1,000% on the teachings of the church. And he, in a way, should try to make himself disappear, and just point people in the direction of Holy Mother Church, what she's always taught. Because there's such confusion going on right now that almost everybody can see the confusion. So, for example, when Pope Francis, for whatever reason, calls for blessing of gay couples. Now, not gay marriage, but gay couples. Well, the world looks at that and sees confusion. Well, what does the church teach? Well, the church teaches on her catechism that it's a mortal sin. Homosexual acts are wrong. They're inherently, intrinsically disordered. So why does your pope want to be blessing couples, many of whom are already married, by the way? They've been married by the state, and now they're getting a blessing from the Father Jimmy Martins of the world. My only point is not to criticize Francis in bringing this up. My point is to say, look at the confusion. People don't understand, like, what is your church teaching versus what's your praxis, the way your church is acting and behaving. There's so much confusion out there. And I bring it up only to point back to the fact that the traditional Catholic tries as best he can to avoid that confusion by staying with tradition.
It does seem like the confusion has accelerated in the past 20, 30 years maybe, especially after the council. Then you had, a lot of division in families, for sure, that happened, and confusion of, well, what do we believe anymore? So I like the answer, because we just, what does it say in 2 Thessalonians? Hold fast to the traditions you were taught by us, whether in word or letter.
Yeah, and I've found that it's the I don't even know where I lifted this from, but the hammer of tradition. When you start looking into any of these issues that there's confusion on, and you go through the history of the church, there's popes, there's saints, there's councils. And it's just a hammer. Boom, 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 boom. So, to return to that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for the sake of clarity.
That voice belongs to Brad Markham. We didn't even introduce Brad Markham. He's just like
the plagiarist. He can't recall where he heard this.
Yeah. I'm just covering my bases there.
Brad's joining us too. He's been with us a lot.
Michael, when I'm listening to you and you say you're quoting someone who says there seems to be a lot of confusion in your church, that sounds like that statement's coming from someone who isn't of the faith of the Catholic Church. But that wouldn't be limited to people who are outside the church. There's significant, substantial confusion of those who were baptized as an infant or have entered into the church later into their life. What say you about the confusion within the church of the faithful? Let's
use something really easy that I think right now during Lent your listeners can readily appreciate. And again, it's not doctrinal, so we don't have to get afraid of getting too heavy on this. But what does the average Catholic think he needs to do to observe Lent? What does he think he needs to do?
Yeah.
Most of them have no idea. So recently, Cardinal Dolan took to his program, his TV program, and said, he kind of admonished Catholics. He said, look at all these Muslims. Ramadan starts tomorrow. The Muslims actually practice they observe fasting. Ramadan. Yeah. They're going to be fasting. He gives this little story about that. And he says, they are shaming us. We need to buck up, buddy. We need to, and in a way, I agree with Cardinal Dolan. Like, yeah, we do. But what I would love to ask Cardinal Dolan is, Eminence, why do you suppose that is? Why do so many Catholics have no idea? They're not breaking the rules. They don't know what the rules are anymore.
Right.
All year long. I grew up in a traditional Catholic. I strike that. I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, Catholic family. Mm-hmm. So every Friday, of course, you abstain from meat. That's just the way it was. So I use it as an example so people can see how silly and low-level, subtle. I shouldn't say silly, but how subtle it kind of was. Where all of a sudden the church comes out and says, and Mother Church comes out and says, you don't have to abstain from meat. Do something else. Okay, anybody who's a father or a mother understands how dangerous that is to say to your children, you don't have to follow the rule, just make sure you do something to kind of make up for it. That's sort of like the rule. Well, no, we are like children. We're children of God, and Holy Mother Church needs to tell us, instruct us what to do, and actually giving us all these options has brought on a crisis in the church, because all of a sudden, we being weak vessels, most of the time, well, if we don't really have to abstain from meat, then we're not going to do it. Or how about Mass on Sunday? Used to be, it was a mortal sin to miss Mass on Sunday. Is it still? I don't know. I've not heard a bishop use the word mortal sin in years.
Well, I think
know.
it depends on which diocese you live in.
That's very true. Yeah, right.
My wife came from a hair appointment since Lent began. And she was just flabbergasted when she got home. She couldn't wait to tell me that she overheard a conversation down the hall or a chair away, whatever it was, that, you don't have to abstain from meat anymore because a bishop had said that that's no longer the practice. Yeah. So we're off the hook.
Right.
How can that be?
Right. We've so lost our Catholic identity. I remember being in a confessional line one time. This is just anecdotally, but it was funny. And the line was quite long, thank God. And it was time for Mass to begin. This was in a Novus Ordo church. And Father gets up and leaves the confessional and goes back to the sacristy. A few moments later, a janitor comes out with a bucket and a mop. And he says to everyone standing in line, he says, just to let you guys know, Father says, we ran out of time today, but because you're all here, you're all absolved from your sins, so don't worry about it.
Wow.
And everybody's like, well, that's great. Now I don't have to confess. So that shows, this isn't a malicious man. These are guys that are trying to be nice or whatever, accommodating to the people in the line. But it shows you how much we've just lost.
I wonder if the janitor didn't have a bucket and a mop, if absolution would have been granted.
that was the form.
Just crossed my mind.
It matter.
Right.
That was the form in matter.
I say it's interesting to me. I found tradition when I was 38. So well into life, finding the Latin Mass. I mean, I went to graduate school for Catholic studies and for Thomistic philosophy. Didn't know about the Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine that? Mm-hmm. But as I got into the tradition, it almost became like breathing, because your life becomes liturgical, and you're following these families that are, today is this saint's feast day, and we're cooking this meal because it's this saint, and Tom's favorite, moving the high feast days to the following Sunday. When you take that kind of stuff away, you lose that rhythm. We're liturgical beings.
Talk about that, Michael. Talk about that. I mean, my favorite rant is Ascension Thursday, now Ascension Sunday. I mean, doesn't that diminish that which is required to be Catholic, which is... Isn't the call to Catholicism to follow Christ imply, involve, otherwise require sacrifice? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, what if we got to January 1st when our employers award our vacation time and we began requesting liturgical days, liturgical feast days off, like the Annunciation, like the Ascension, the Immaculate Conception, and said, all right, I'm not coming to work these days. And I'm the first in my department to request these days off. Mm-hmm. What say you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the soft apostasy of low expectations. All of a sudden, we just...
Wait a minute. You've used that line before.
Yeah, but it really has been the low expectations of the church that has been what I think has caused the church to go into, I shouldn't say the church, but the human element of the church, a lot of people, to simply stop showing up. Nobody expects us to do it. And again, I like to use the analogy of raising children. Mm-hmm. I mean, little sacrifices during Lent, when you have a house full of little children, they wouldn't break. You don't have to beat them over the head to make them abstain or give up the little things they want to give up for Lent. That's part of the family life during that season, and it only gets stronger. And if you tell a child he doesn't have to do that, first of all, they're going to be very offended, because they want to have the rules. I think we as human beings, I think we do respond for the most part. We think it's going to be great not to have any obligations, but really when you when you don't have any obligation, oftentimes people will talk about when a fellow retires or a woman retires and dies very soon thereafter because they don't have anything to do.
Isn't that an interesting phenomenon?
Yeah, right. And I think it's the same with the church. When you don't have any way or any need to practice your life, your faith, it kind of dies, and we see it dying all around the world. And I think that could be one of the things that ultimately, with this sort of clash between Muslims and Christians and Jews and so forth the world over, Christians are looking to try to find some identity again, just because everybody else who's non-Christian seems to have an identity and we don't anymore.
Do you think that's a masculine characteristic?
I think it is. And I can tell you, we do this pilgrimage in France, which is a 3-day, 70-mile pilgrimage across France. Those are a bunch of young people, and that's where you really get to this idea that if much is expected of young people, they're going to give more. They're not going to just do what they're expected to do. They're going to give even more. And so you've got young people who are walking, by the end of those 3 days, they're walking on blisters. They're walking on, blood blisters. They're bandaged up. They're sleeping on the ground. They're walking for, all day, 12 hours a day to get to the Latin Mass in Chartres, have Mass each day. And you know what happens in the middle of the night during that pilgrimage? I've seen it with my own eyes many times. I go downtown. I'm usually looking to go to use the restroom, but I'll pass by the outdoor chapel, and guess who's kneeling in the wet grass at 3 a.m? 500 young people who do not have to be there, in front of our Blessed Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. So you see that this is like a microcosm of how the old church used to be. I remember it. You probably do too, because I feel like we're the last generation that remembers the Catholic neighborhood, and it was very similar to that. You went to the 24 to the
40 hours,
adoration. You wanted to. It was part. You couldn't have Easter without Lent. You couldn't have Christmas without Advent. There was a symmetry to all of the way that
there was a neighborhood expectation that you would be there.
Absolutely. And so there was a human element that helped us all, sustain us in the faith, and you wanted to do that. It was like a football team. I played a little football in college. Football is difficult. You need to show up for practice. You need to get yourself in shape, and then you have the honor and the privilege of trying to show how much you've learned during a game. Well, it's the same with the faith. You have to do your part. In the Catholic neighborhood, the old Catholic Church, the Catholic priests used to expect that. So I don't know about you. I had all these horrible nuns that supposedly were beating the snot out of everybody 24/7. I went through those schools. These women were incredibly generous. We loved them. We wanted to learn the penmanship and do the swirls to get penmanship just right for them. It was a beautiful thing, and it worked.
Yeah.
Well, let's pick up the Palmer method right after the break, Colleen.
That's right. You're listening to The Chatter on KCRD 98.3 FM. Our guest today is Michael Matt, and Brad Markham is also joining in the conversation. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
We're back in the studios with Michael Matt. What a great first episode.
Yeah, I love talking about the traditional Catholic stuff. I was born during Vatican II, so I don't have really a memory of it. Although growing up in Dubuque, 60,000 people, a dozen Catholic churches, they all had a school. I didn't know a Protestant until I went to college.
Yeah.
Dubuque used to be the most Catholic county
in the country.
In the country.
Yeah.
Now I don't know what it is. But
when I was growing up, everybody was Catholic in name, but looking back, I don't know that we were Catholic.
Yeah. I think a lot of what happened was, our parents just kind of followed the priests. Well, they're supposed to know, so if they say it's okay, it must be okay.
I think Pope Benedict said this, Michael, that one of the great threats to Catholicism would be that it was relegated to the status of a social construct. And I think that plays into what you're saying, Brad, is somewhere in our lifetime, we only knew Catholic people, but that became something of a way of life and shifted to a social construct. We were somehow a membership of some group, and we've lost the way of life. Do you think?
I do, and I think one of the very sad aspects of it is the why. Why did we do this to ourselves?
You got an answer?
I think it's just the obvious. I think the Catholic Church was accomplishing way too much, and I think as a Catholic, I can sit here and try to convince you, if you're a non-Catholic, of the rightness of this faith, this church that was founded by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We can do that all day long, but why don't we just look at what was happening culturally back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in Hollywood, for example.
Wow. Yeah.
Where the Catholic Church dominated Hollywood. I'm thinking about Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby movies about priests, movies about nuns, Ingrid Bergman playing nun and doing Bells of St. Mary. It was such a powerful force that you could hardly make a big movie without a Waterfront or whatever, without having a Carl Malden playing a Catholic priest, because the church was so omnipresent in this culture.
It was omnipresent, and they would tell Catholics to go or not go to a film,
Right.
and Catholics listened.
What was that? The Legion of Decency or
Decency,
something?
and it's really this Pius XI, Vigilante Curiae was the name of his encyclical that he wrote about the motion picture industry. And I think to give your listeners an idea of how seriously Catholics took the faith at that time, if a movie house produced a film that was objectionable to Catholic moral theology, not only could Catholics not go to that movie, obviously, but the proprietor of that theater, you could not support his theater again until he apologized for that movie. So now you have things like William Wyler coming out in 1959 making Ben-Hur.
Right.
Because part of the reason that Hollywood was suffering like it was because of Vigilante Curiae, was because of Pius XI, who was trying to exercise moral authority, and for the vast majority, the most part of Catholics, the Catholics, they listened to this and they believed in this and they supported this. So William Wyler comes along and he says, I got to make a movie to save Hollywood. So he makes this very, very Catholic, beautiful movie called Ben-Hur. He was Jewish, by the way. You see, a
Sure.
Jewish guy's got to make a movie about Jesus to do the right to do it right. But if you look back at that history, I know we don't have time to go into it all today, but this is not my opinion. This is actually happening. There was such a threat, even politically, that Catholics were having so many kids, so many children, and they were becoming such a serious, the families of immigrants, Catholic immigrants, becoming such a serious voting bloc, that there was a concern that the United States of America was going to become a Catholic country because of the openness to life and the Catholic Church. Because remember, this is after 1939 at the Lambeth Conference, when the Protestant sects embraced contraception.
Yeah.
And here's this little man in Rome. This is another, and then I'll shut up, go to your next point. But this little priest in Rome who says what Catholics can and just thunders the truth. Contraception is wrong. Now what is he doing? He's actually saying to Catholic couples, married couples, what they can and cannot do behind the closed doors of their own bedrooms. And do you know what? They obeyed him because they believed that they were on this earth to know, love, and serve God so that they could save their souls. And that was the extent of it.
And when the Lambeth Conference came out with that, I think it was in the spring or May, it was by the end of the year that Costi Connubii was written.
Right.
So there was an immediate response from
Right.
the Pope on what is allowed for Catholics and why. I mean,
Right.
it was a nice, thick document, well, fairly long, but it was footnoted with saints and previous teachings and all the way
Yeah.
back. It gave a solid foundation of why Catholics believe what we believe and why we behave like we behave. And it was an instant rebuttal to the Lambeth Conference, as opposed to when the pill came out in 1960, and there was lots of talk that the church was going to change her stance, and we heard nothing. They heard nothing for 8 years until Humanae Vitae was issued, and that was a very thin, 20 pages maybe, and hardly any footnotes of teaching and historically what we believed. And so it said the truth, right, that Catholics could not use contraception. It was intrinsically disordered, but it was like a little feather, little Q-tip response.
While at the same time, essentially, Humanae Vitae essentially equalizes the ends of marriage. Very subtly.
Yes,
Very
yes.
subtly.
Go deeper
Yes,
on that, because I
yes,
don't think
yes.
people understand the
So the-
couple ends of marriage.
It had been that the ends of marriage were the procreation and education of children, secondarily the controlling of concupiscence. If you read, a careful read of Humanae Vitae shows that Paul VI basically equalizes them. If doesn't actually even put controlling of concupiscence above procreation and education of children. So this goes back to this question. I'm not saying I condemn that document. I'm just saying it was poorly written in that sense. And so then when some years later, when you start having rampant promiscuity, sex outside of marriage, and finally gay marriage,
Yeah.
we really had lost the strongest Catholic argument, which is that the point and purpose of marriage is procreation and education of children. That was it. And so even in some of the good documents that did find that you're right, after years, find the Humanae Vitae does the right thing on contraception. But even then, there's already a weakening of how it's presented.
And in the confessionals, priests were telling married women, well, they're going to change the teaching, so go ahead
Right.
and get on birth control because we're going to change. And then they put a commission in charge of it, the birth control commission with lay people. And I mean, it all looked like it was headed toward the church going to approve.
And wasn't the delay of that Humani Vitae document, because it was delayed for months or a couple of years or something like that, doesn't that speak to the craziness of it? Had it been an immediate response, as you mentioned in 1939, that it was just a matter of days, few months for Casti Connubii to be issued, it speaks to the speed and accuracy and clarity.
Right.
As opposed to do that. I'm often I'm sorry, Brad, but I just wanted to make a note. Someone reminds me frequently that the sacrament is called holy matrimony, and its purpose is to make the woman a mother. Isn't that the translation loosely? Matrimony.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying it's that weaponized ambiguity. 8 years of priests in the confessional, and I've gotten that from priests from that generation. Take something with family struggles into the confessional and well, just put your wife on the pill. Just do that.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a long time coming. I think that's another problem with traditional Catholics is sometimes those who haven't done quite enough research convey the impression that we believe that before Vatican II everything was absolutely fine, which of course is inherently and obviously and patently ridiculous because the papal hero of our movement, of course, is St. Pius X. What was he talking about back in 1904 when he wrote Pascendi, other than modernist infiltration at the heart and bosom of the church? So this delay and sluggishness that you're talking about, maybe it took 69 years to really reach that level of sluggishness, but that's what it has its roots much earlier in the 20th century, where the church began to signal sound a very uncertain trumpet, and now, of course, today it's completely crazy. But
What's your analysis on how it took us? Why did we get here? I mean, it took 60, 70 years to do that, but any thoughts on the influences in that? I mean, is it as simple as enemies, domestic and foreign? Or?
I mean, it sounds that's a statement of the obvious, I suppose, to say you really have to go back to the Enlightenment. You have to go back to the Protestant Revolt, which tore Christendom.
I mean, you're talking 500 years.
Right, and that speaks to the strength of the Catholic Church, that she built the greatest civilization that man has ever seen. I always use the examples of the great cathedrals of Europe. These are unsigned, anonymous works of art that came out of love for the church. So, and you see that everywhere you look. This powerful, powerful civilization that the church built out of love, and mostly by the simple people, by the families, by the men and women who were raising children and didn't have much money and so forth. So I think you see this, and then there's this. The Enlightenment begins, and you see the Freemasonry in 1717, which is a full-on assault on the Catholic Church because of what she was able to do culturally and from a civilizational point of view, not to just build pretty buildings, but to send millions to heaven, to help millions reach the goal. So a good priest will tell you that one of the big problems with a heretic like Martin Luther, for example, is that because of him, millions will lose their souls. So I think we're seeing this primordial battle between Satan and Christ and God, Christ and Antichrist, children of light, children of darkness, and that war has been raging. But some of these big pivotal events, like the Enlightenment, the Protestant Revolt, the establishment of Freemasonry, people can say, "Well, Freemasonry, what are you looking for? Like scary guys with Richie Cunningham's dad fez caps on? What's the problem?"
Right.
Well, if you look into that more seriously, you realize that no organization has been condemned successfully by more successive popes than Freemasonry. Well, you at least have to look into it. It's not Richie Cunningham's dad. The church was very concerned about the secret societies infiltrating and trying to destroy the church. So you have to look into that without becoming a crazy conspiracy theorist. You have to understand the popes were not they weren't given to conspiracy theorizing. They knew that we were under assault, that there was an attack going on. And of course, then with the 20th century and the modernism, especially that had infiltrated the church, according to Pope Pius X, you see a much more rapid undermining of the Catholic Church, causing people to become very insecure about asserting themselves. And then, of course, what happens at Vatican II, which is the coming out party for modernism, basically hoists the white flag of surrender and one dogma, that no one wants to talk about, but that everyone should be talking about, and that's extra ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. This is not an easy dogma, and it has to be discussed and understood in charity and so forth. But the vast majority of Catholics today, since Vatican II, they don't believe that's true at all. In other words, everyone's saved. If everyone's saved, there's no point and purpose for the church. If there's no point and purpose for the church, why should we bother going to Mass? Why practice the faith at all? So we don't have much time, but those are that would be the sort of general framework if we were to have a 3-day conference on what happened, the things that you would have to discuss.
And you're calling that dogma outside the church.
Absolutely.
Which means...
It's a defined dogma. You must accept it in pain of mortal sin. A defined dogma of the church.
And I think if you had 100 Catholics from across the diocese, you'd come up with not many people
maybe one,
who would subscribe to the dogma.
Because the problem is, in the typical Luciferian genius, the opposite of that is the Christ-like thing to do. Be tolerant, be forgiving, tell your Protestant neighbors, your Jewish neighbors, they're fine. They don't have to make a change. This is what Jesus would do. He doesn't want people to be uncomfortable. So a good Catholic now, one who's still bothering to go to church, has the exact doctrinal opposite of that. In other words, you want to accommodate everyone. So before this began to happen in the Catholic Church at the highest levels, what the church did was tell everyone what they must do. Teach, lovingly, teach what men and women must do to save their souls. After the Revolution, it was just the opposite. Now they were bending over backwards to tell everyone that they didn't have to do these things to be saved, that the Catholic Church does not say you have to become a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. You're going to be fine. That's a Luciferian inversion.
Isn't that a loss of charity?
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
True charity would say, Christ established a church. We need it. We need the sacraments to get to our goal of heaven. That's true charity.
Well, you mentioned Freemasonry, and one of their pushes in the early days was Republican form of government, republicanism. Not the party, but just the idea of an elected representative government to undermine monarchy, which is what the church is. So I thought we had talked in the break here that we wanted to talk about the synod, and I personally see that as pivoting towards republicanism in the church, which looks like a revolutionary movement. So just teeing up the synod talk here.
Yeah, we had talked that maybe we would talk about the synod because lately what's coming out in the news is Francis has said that now the synod's going to go to 2028.
Perpetual synod, Michael?
It sounds kind of like a perpetual synod, doesn't it?
Yeah, and he wakes up from a hospital bed, poor man, suffering a very serious sickness. He's been on a ventilator. I think it was Cardinal Parolin said he has to be taught and shown how to speak again after that.
Really?
When he was in the hospital. And yet he wakes up, supposedly, they're telling us, he wakes up and says, what I want is another 3 years of synodality. What do you think are the chances that that's actually a true news report?
Probably.
I don't think.
Slim.
So you can see this. Who's running the church right now? Who's saying these things? Now, Francis is very much into synodality, but it's going to get even worse now if it just is. That's going to be the solution. And as I pointed out last night when I was giving a talk here, Pope Paul VI, of all people, condemns back in 1972 what he calls synodalism, not synodality, but it's the same thing, synodalism. As being the undoing of the church. It's going to cause massive confusion. It'll undo marriage. This whole idea of listening constantly and then adapting by what you're hearing from people who are dumbed down. That's what synodality is. So this is not a question of being disloyal to the Pope. This is a question of this is not working. And if you want to listen to something, holiness, eminences, excellencies, please listen to us. It is not working to look at a world that is a church that has been, I think, almost just criminally dumbed down. They don't know anything about the faith anymore. And to say to them, what would you like to see change in your church? How can we accompany you? How can we accommodate you? Think about how evil that is. That's like absolutely zero discipline, zero education of your family, of your children, and then saying, what would you like to do now? How do you want the family to be run? This is wrong. Now, maybe there are really good people. I've covered the synod in Rome as a journalist. Every single synod, I've gone over there and slogged through it from the Vatican press office, and I can tell you they don't know how to define what this is, which to me suggests a diabolical disorientation even about what they're doing. Again, Paul VI condemned it, and yet they're holding it up now as the solution, this whole idea of listening, a synodal church. I would love to ask them, and I have asked them this in the Vatican Press Hall, the representatives of the Synod on synodality, what were the bishops doing for the past 100 years? Are you saying that the bishops of the Catholic Church could not even be bothered to listen to their own people? Pastors were not allowed? This is crazy. This isn't true. And by the way, guess who's missing from the Synod on synodality? This is going to blow your mind, or the minds of your your listeners. You know who wasn't invited? Pastors. There are no pastors at the Synod on synodality. These are the people whose job, institutionally and hierarchically, it's been to listen to the sheep. And they weren't there in Rome. They weren't there. You had Jimmy Martin there and people like that there, but the pastors of the church were not represented.
Deliberate?
I believe so. I believe so.
Our guest is Michael Matt on episode number 165. You catch Michael on Remnant TV and the Remnant newspaper. What a great publication. We're going to be back for segment 3 of episode 165 after these announcements. We're back in the KCRD studios with Michael Matt of Remnant TV. This is episode 165, Colleen.
It is. We've been having a great discussion, and even though there is a lot of confusion in the church and division, as we've talked about in the first 2 segments, we want to end on some signs of hope, right? Because there are some good things happening in the church. There are some good things happening. And Michael, you had mentioned in an earlier segment about the pilgrimage, the Chartres pilgrimage, and the young people. So that's a big sign of hope. Tell us a little bit more about the pilgrimage, what you see, how it's growing.
Yeah, sure. Let me just say, the dour traditionalist makes no sense to me, not in 2025. I've been traditional Catholic all my life, so I lived through the 70s, the early 70s is when I learned to serve the Latin Mass. I was in a little altar that my parents had in our basement. There was no hope, no prospect at all for a return of the traditional Latin Mass, and yet the great pioneers of the movement, Michael Davies, Walter Matt, Archbishop Lefebvre, they all knew that in God's good time the church would be restored. So I'm sitting here with a gigantic grin on my face for what's happening in traditional Catholicism. I can't even believe the success story that it's become. It is a youth movement. I've been going for 32, 33 years to the Chartres pilgrimage in France, which is a pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres again. And that average age is 20 years old. And that's 20, 30,000 young people gathered. And that represents, and of course there are hundreds and hundreds of priests, young priests who are all from the various parishes and groups where those young people come from. And so it's not just the number, it's also the families that are represented, because this is a very grueling pilgrimage. So you might see, 2,000 young people. Well, those are the healthiest and youngest ones of families of 9, 10 children who are grown in some cases. You see what I'm saying? And parents and priests and parishes. So it really is a massive youth movement. It cannot be crushed. And I think even the efforts that have been made by the Vatican to sort of curb access to the traditional Latin Mass is a massive sign of hope, because what they used to do is they pretended like we didn't exist. It just didn't matter. Such a small movement. It was for little old ladies in tennis shoes. As soon as they died, it died, was a prevailing attitude in Rome. Now the Vatican is positively fixated on it. And I think that's can only be explained because they have seen it's a youth movement. They have seen it, the young people, the young families, the homeschoolers all around the country, the traditional Latin Mass families, young and old, were even willing to take a pretty courageous stand during COVID. This is a movement that's not only young, full of faith, full of inspiration, hope, and yes, love and charity. It's also ready to suffer. It's ready to fight back. We are not going to allow the church that we love to simply cease to matter and cease to exist in its traditional form. And so that I find that to be extremely encouraging. And the Chartres pilgrimage is the annual event, the most important event, as far as I'm concerned, in the church today, because it brings 30 countries together. It brings all these people together. We've had Cardinal Gerhard Muller has said the Mass at Chartres. Cardinal Burke has said the Mass at Chartres. Bishop Schneider has said the Mass at Chartres. Cardinal Sarah. Powerful, powerful people. There is nothing about this pilgrimage which exists outside of Mother Church. You know what I'm saying? It's absolutely in the church. As a matter of fact, I, as the U.S. representative, was invited to have lunch with the Bishop of Chartres 2 years ago in his private residence during the pilgrimage, because he recognizes this multinational, powerful force. He's not a friend of ours. He's not a traditionalist. But he's trying to do whatever he can to be politic and to kind of acknowledge this reality. So not depressed even at all. I mean, full of hope and inspiration. The group here in Platteville, I feel the same way last night. So many young people, so much enthusiasm for a movement that should have died a long time ago and has only gotten exponentially stronger.
Mm-hmm. You make a good point because, there has been the Latin Mass around here a little bit, but nothing like, in other places. And yet, when they came out to say you can't have the Latin Mass, I thought, they're not coming out to say that because there's one church in Platteville that's having the Latin Mass, right? They're seeing it in a lot of places, and now it's got their attention. Why is this such a growing movement? What are the young people seeing there?
You guys got me thinking of John Henry Newman, and he talks about one of the signs of the true faith is chronic vigor. This is in his essays on development of Christian doctrine. And you look around at the Latin Mass. I have just a kind of an anecdote. When I first came into the Latin Mass 6 or 7 years ago, I had 2 of my children were 9 and 11 or in that age, and I went by myself initially, and then Mom and I were splitting which masses we were going to. It's a little bit more of a sacrifice to get a half hour away and that sort of thing, but if the kids were up, I'd say, hey, come with Dad to my Mass. And I mean, maybe 2 times we went together, and I'm asking my 9 and 10-year-old, what Mass do you want to go to? We want to go to Dad's. Mm-hmm. Like, not even a question. Mm-hmm. We want to go to Dad's. Mm-hmm. And that's that youthful, chronic vigor, And now the whole crew is there with me every Sunday. So,
When I listen to these stories, Michael, I'm reminded, I think it's Acts of the Apostles, when they bring is it Peter and James back in for chastisement, and Gamaliel speaks up and says, be careful, if this is a human orientation, it'll die on its own. If it's from God, you can't win. Something to that extent. Right. I'm paraphrasing.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that really is applicable because there's no explanation for this. When Ecclesia Dei, the document first came down, the expectation was that Pope John Paul was accommodating the few older people who still had this inclination or this attachment.
Right.
They never, ever anticipated, and I think they were right not to anticipate it from a human point of view. They never anticipated the youth movement that it's become. And I think that speaks to the fact that what the Holy Mother Church gives us liturgically, and the faith and the doctrine that she gives us, but liturgically, the connection every week or every day is so beautiful and so powerful that you don't have to teach people, you don't have to teach young people to be attracted to it. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes it's one exposure to it, and sometimes not, but oftentimes one exposure to it is so different with the Ad Orientem and the Latin. It's very intriguing to a young person who wants to kind of explore a little bit more.
Is it fair to just call it intriguing or different, or should we be acknowledging something greater, more supernatural?
Well, the only I guess cautionary word I would say to that is I have experienced it oftentimes the opposite, where I went to Christendom College for my college career or education, and we would go to D.C. Old St. Mary's to have the Latin Mass. I would bring my friends with me, and they were all pro-life, conservative families, and they didn't understand. They didn't get it. So I would only say, to answer your question, like sometimes people, it takes a little while. Sometimes they don't understand. Why is this? Monsignor Gamber talked about this in his Roman Rite, where he talks about in the new Mass, the priest is more or less transformed into a huckster. He has to sell it. He has to be funny. He has to be charming. He has to kind of make it work. In the Latin Mass, the priest disappears completely. So if you're used to the priest as huckster and more of an entertaining thing, they even have the choirs or the band, the little pop band, right up in front now in many churches. So they're used to being stimulated, like it's a rock or a pop concert or something. So after a few generations of that, it's for some people who don't have sort of a grace to see it right away, it's more difficult to understand, and that requires us to be patient and loving and to share. For other people, there's such a marked contrast, and it's so beautiful that it doesn't take much at all. And then I think there's always the possibility that they respond to grace in a certain way and come back to the Latin Mass very quickly.
Yeah, it took me about a dozen times, to be honest, a dozen times. And I think because I was so caught up in, okay, where are we in the Novus Ordo right now? As the Latin Mass was going along, I was trying to figure out where we were in the Novus Ordo. And as soon as I stopped doing that, it was all great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to be re-educated. Gamber spoke about this as well. And Cardinal Ratzinger wrote the preface for that book, so that's why I'm bringing up Monsignor Gamber again, because it's important. But I mean, re-education and what the point and purpose of liturgy is. We've lost, most Catholics today have lost track of that. The fact that, going back even into the Old Testament with the Levites and the tents where the Holy of Holies was, where God was worshipped, where the sacrifices happened, the people couldn't even see that. The Levites could see it. The Levites went in and did this as priests. The people were outside. They couldn't see it. They couldn't hear it. You see that a little bit in the Ukrainian Rite, the Eastern Rite churches, even still, where you have that iconostasis, where the people are actually separated from what's happening, from the Holy of Holies. From the once you realize the point and purpose of the Mass is God offering God to God, it isn't so necessary to understand every single word and every single movement that's going on up there. So there does have to be an education process, I think, as well as what is the point and purpose of liturgy to begin with. And
to go back to what you were saying about the young people, it was not intuitive to think it would attract young people.
Absolutely.
Because, the stereotypical thing was, well, they're not speaking in your vernacular. You can't even hear the priest anyway. You don't know what they're saying. All those things, which some are true, some are not true, because, they might have Latin on the left side, but English is on the right side. So you know what they're saying.
Exactly.
Right.
But when you realize that people say, well, his back is to you. And I think, well, in Novus Ordo, his back is to the Lord. Which is worse? Mm-hmm. I would rather his back be to me than to the Lord.
I always have that thought, too, that it's in the Novus Ordo, they've switched the primary and the secondary. So the people are the primary in the Novus Ordo. Mm-hmm. You face the people, you talk to the people, you have your lectors,
we're fully participating. And we get graces out of going to Mass, but we're not there for us. Mm-hmm. And that's what the Latin Mass teaches you, that you're there for God. Mm-hmm. And secondarily, but then the graces flow. Like, I have seen my family become so Catholic from going to the Latin Mass.
Yeah.
There's real simple. We need leadership. We need to be led to find God. I was just using the example. What struck me, we went and climbed Kilimanjaro in Africa this past summer, and there's guides, those mountain guides. If you don't follow them, you are going to die. And they're always at the front, and they're leading us to an unfamiliar territory towards the mountaintop. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine if you're a pilgrim or a hiker, and all of a sudden this guide is just awkwardly turning around and wanting to talk to you and walk backwards up the mountain? So there's and young people can understand this. No, the priest is leading us. The priest, okay, use an easier one. He's the bus driver. Do you want your bus driver to stand up and start chit-chatting and giving you some comic routine and turn around and face you while driving the bus? No. So there's this really easy idea that the priest is leading us pilgrims to God, and there's nothing rude about his back being towards us. He's leading us because that's what he is. He's a priest.
I got to admit, I didn't see Kilimanjaro coming.
You didn't have that on your bingo card for segment 3?
Didn't have it on my bingo card.
Who we did that walk with was our friend Christopher Wendt, right?
Yeah.
No way.
Oh,
No
nice.
way.
Yeah, in Africa, but I'll come back sometime. If you want to talk about Africa, talk about hope. Vocations to the traditional Latin Mass priesthood in Africa are just plentiful. The schools, there's lots of signs of hope around the world.
Are they in areas where Archbishop Lefebvre had done his missionary activity?
Well, he basically had a massive influence on Africa. So you would say, and they're very receptive. They're the ones that I went to in Singida. They're not Pius X. They're diocesan priests, but they remember Archbishop Lefebvre very fondly and really.
So we're talking about signs of hope right now in the world, which can seem few and far between with all the confusion going on. But we've talked about the young people that are going on the pilgrimage. We've talked about the young people that are attracted to the traditional Latin Mass. What do you think about homeschoolers? Is that another sign of hope? Can we be hopeful about some of our homeschoolers?
It's the front line, I mean, that's without homeschooling has been a game changer. That's where the recruits are. That's where the Marines are. That's where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. The Navy SEALs of Catholicism are coming out of these homeschool movements. And I always say, because I am a homeschool father, and that means I basically support my wife because she's the one that is doing the yeoman's labor there. But I've gotten to know homeschool groups all around the world, especially in this country. Homeschool moms are the frontline heroes. They really are. They're the ones, and because it's not easy. So it's really simplistic to say, well, there's nothing to it. It's really hard. And not only the work of making sure you do it right, you teach your children correctly and make sure they're prepared for life, but also, especially a few years ago, sort of the mockery. You know, what you and the missus are learning the youngins in the kitchen with all the chickens. Huh? Is that how that works? Yeah.
There was a lot of that. Teeth? Do they all have their teeth?
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing. So they withstood all of that, and they've transformed homeschooling into a powerful political force as well, as far as within the church, educating people who are going to fight. So homeschooling is a huge hope. I think another big sign of hope for me is the number of bishops and priests who are coming over now and realizing there's a problem. All the bishops aren't bad. I said last night, we have this Catholic Identity Conference out in Pittsburgh every year, and we're going to have 5 bishops there this year speaking, and they're not like order, they're not like SSPX, they're actual, from various countries in Europe. I'm not going to say who they are because I don't want to get them shut down, but they could be prohibited, I suppose, from coming. But that's just that whoever would have seen that coming. Bishops who are saying, no, okay, this has gone on too far. This has gone on too long. We need to get back to the Catholic thing, and it's happening.
And this is your annual conference in Pittsburgh. October-ish. How many years has this been going?
This is, I think we're about 18 years now.
Wow.
It's one of the largest conferences. We have about 800 people in the chairs, and then it's thousands joining us by live stream. And we've had high-profile people, even, for example, Candace Owens spoke there last year. And I only bring that up because I think it's really interesting how traditional Catholicism now has become a point of interest for a lot of people, not just, dyed-in-the-wool traditionalists or people who grew up. Lots of people see it almost immediately. There's something very interesting going on within traditional Catholicism that they want to know more about. And so I think we have a real beautiful opportunity to try to welcome people like that, even if we don't agree with everything they're saying or they're doing, whatever. That curiosity about tradition is something that we need to work with, and there's a lot of it.
We got a couple minutes left before we break on segment 3, but given your sense, your optimism, where do you see the trajectory? I know you're not a soothsayer, but where do you see the trajectory of all we're talking about?
I think the situation when the church is becoming so critical that you have bishops, cardinals, and popes talking about we need to figure out how we listen to people through synodality. And good for them. They're trying something. I'm not even running them down. I'm just saying that's a tacit admission of massive crisis in the mainstream church, that they can't even figure out how to listen to people anymore. People are so sick and tired of the way things are going in the church establishment right now. A change has to happen. Traditionalism seems like it can't be crushed, even though there are lots of people who are trying to crush the Latin Mass. It doesn't seem to be possible. I think God has a different idea for that. So I think it's going to continue on this. I think we have everything that's needed worldwide for this remnant of believers to continue to restore. We're a restoration movement. I don't see it stopping. I think between that and the homeschooling movement, even to an extent, the political situation like in this country where you see this backlash against wokeism, whatever you think of Trump,
right.
There is a serious backlash. People are sick and tired of DEI and that sort of thing. It's all pointing in an interesting direction. And I think traditional Catholics should not sit back on their laurels and celebrate the victory and do a victory lap. We should be saying God has given us an opportunity now. There are people who are looking, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the Russell Brands of the world, all these people looking for truth. Well, guess where they're going to find the truth, the fullness of truth? Within the church that Jesus Christ founded, outside of which there is no salvation. That's the traditional Catholic church faith. And we need to be right there and ready to lovingly lead people to the light in a day and age that's at war with that light. We're the ones, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but we're here on this point, on this earth, at this moment in history for a reason. And to me, everything looks positive. Everything looks like it's up to us. We're the ones. This is ours to lose at this point. Keep the faith and go out and fight for it. And I think it's going to be a lot easier.
And so if people want more information about this movement and the way it's going, they might want to subscribe to your newspaper. They could go to remnantnewspaper.com. That's REMNANT newspaper.com, and they can subscribe, either get it in their postal mailbox or get it online. Is that correct?
Indeed.
And then you have a podcast on, tell us the website.
Remnant-TV.com. We're on YouTube as well, Remnant TV. We're trying to move on to a more independent platform successfully so far. So everything can be accessed from remnantnewspaper.com.
Okay, wonderful. Well, you've been listening to Michael Matt on the Chatter today, along with Brad Markham and Tom Oglesby and myself. And so we are wrapping up episode 165. So we are going to end with a prayer.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Glory be
To the Father, and to the
Son,
Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.